Thank you for agreeing to be indoors on such a hot day. I'm Jeffrey G. O'Brien. I run the Spring Holloway along with my co-curator Jane Gregory. And tonight we're really fortunate to have Anna Moschovakis reading. This isn't technically part of the Holloway Spring series. Anna is our visiting writer and has been here all semester. Let me just go into some facts about this position that Anna is temporarily inhabiting gracefully and fully. So tonight's event, as I just said, is not strictly speaking a part of the regular Spring Holloway reading series, but it's central to that series' intention and source. Tonight we'll hear from the 2015-2016, and here's the mouthful, Roberta C. Holloway Lecturer in the Practice of Poetry. Anna Moschovakis, in recognition of her significant creative work and to express gratitude for her attention to our undergraduate poets this semester. Among the other Holloway poets who precede Moschovakis are such figures as Michael Palmer, Yusef Komunyakaa, Lisa Robertson, Ann Carson, and our own Robert Haas and Lynn Higinian. The unique lectureship came into existence in 1981 through a bequest given to the university as part of the estate of Roberta C. Holloway, who received her BA in English with honors from UC Berkeley in 1923, and her PhD in English here 23 years later in 1945. As required by the terms of the bequest, the committee supervising the lectureship was chaired by Josephine Miles for as long as she was an active faculty member here. Josephine Miles died in 1985 at the age of 74, and she was the first woman to be tenured in Berkeley's English department, and that could not have been easy either before or after tenure. Miles was a nationally recognized and much honored poet whose work now has canonical status in the history of American poetry of the 20th century, and there's a kind of micro-tradition here in the Holloway between Lynn and Cecil and myself, or maybe I should say an affectionate competition, to unearth a Josephine Miles poem that has not yet been read. So I'm going to read a poem by Miles called Memorial Day. Afternoon in the plaza, cries, shrill yells, running and breaking. Students look desperately out of the open windows. We have to be there. A rifle waves in the window. Tear gas gusts in. No one to help in the furtherance of this class in Milton's epics. Well, let's meet tomorrow at my house. Okay, we'll bring the whole grain, wheat germ, raisin bread. Up in the office floors, out in the square, gas of a new kind in experimentation. I choke and cry the tears they call for. So I say, and now we are munching crunchies in the front yard and finishing the patristic part of book 7. Papers are due after the weekend. Please go home and work there and tell your parents the story of these weeks. Even if they believe in the war you're protesting, they will believe you too. Tell them the sorts of pressures, absences of aid, losses of understanding you are working under. They say they've already tried. I get my dad on the phone and he says, you can't tell me, give me mom. And my mom says, you can't tell me, stay out of trouble. The Army helicopter, in its regular rounds of surveillance, drops down low. Our 20 figures in a courtyard may mean trouble. Couldn't we pick these flowers to throw at them? All these camellias overgrown and wasting? Just like Wheeler Hall itself, which is about to undergo renovation. Now let me turn to the work of tonight's reader, and first the details of that human. Anna Moschovakis is the author of 3 books of poetry. I have not been able to get through to everyone, followed by You and 3 Others Are Approaching a Lake, and the just published from Coffee House Press, They and We Will Get Into Trouble for This. And those latter 2 are here for sale courtesy of UPB, and you can buy them after the reading is over. She also has numerous chapbooks, and her translations from the French include texts by Albert Cossary, Claude Cahun, Marcel Sauvageau, Annie Ernaux, and Samira Negrouche, with whom she also collaborates. She teaches part-time in the Writing BFA and MFA programs at Pratt Institute and at the Milton Avery Graduate School of the Arts at Bard College. She's also a longtime member of the amazing Brooklyn-based publishing collective Ugly Duckling Press, for which she serves as an editor, designer, administrator, and probably a lot of other ers. And now to the nature of the poetry. We've long thought of procedure in writing as an escape from personality, and of avant-garde procedure as a departure from Eleatic versions of that escape. More recently, like now, there's a lot of great thinking about all the privilege and whiteness involved in electing to leave one's identity details behind via a few keystrokes for the freedoms of merely formal restriction. When Anna Moschovakis' poem, The Tragedy of Waste, from 2011's You and Three Others Are Approaching a Lake, asks, quote, "What precisely is your procedure?" The emphasis is as much on the possessive adjective, your, as on procedure itself. Procedure for this poet is about you, in every sense of about. Moschovakis is a poet who can braid conceptual writings, repurposing of extant text, with autobiographical confession and narration, so easily it's as though they've never been thought antagonistic to each other, which they have only optionally been. Our own Lynn Haginian's 1980s masterpiece, My Life, sent autobiographical detail through a numerical restriction, 37 sections of 37 sentences at age 37, and plenty of citation, in order to produce a feminist life writing that could bring any information into impertinence for my life, and ran that life out into filiation with everybody's autobiography. Like Haginian, Moschovakis is a poet of invested, inhabited, exuberant procedure, of whatever is the opposite of escape. And she has been similarly attracted to the commons of the pronoun, that site where the personal and the impersonal meet and are pent and exchange their claims and substance. The titles of her 3 books constitute something less than a shapely narrative of the pronominal, while still approaching procedure in their wittily relentless collocation of English words for subjects. I have not been able to get through to everyone. You and 3 others are approaching a lake. They and we will get into trouble for this. I, everyone, you, others, they, we, even this. The emphasis on genderless pronouns makes, especially in relation to Moschovakis' abiding concerns, an argument about what we, unfortunately, is, sadly has been, and could be. For pronouns don't only replace subjects, but objects, and many subjects have been made object and abject in what has passed for history so far. A history Moschovakis summarizes via pronouns in the end of the prologue to You and Three Others Are Approaching a Lake. Quote, "Each moment of courage or loss or revolution, when something pushed something and something fell down." That passage through productively vague somethings is a passage from subject, something pushed, to direct object, pushed something, to the subject of a mortally intransitive verb, something fell down. It allows us to hear not only the loss of life under capital, or the falling of walls and systems in revolution, but how substitutable for each other these narratives are. There is always something on either side of the transitive verb, and to one side of the intransitive one. Routinized objection and revolutionary overthrow are exchangeable through the word something for Moschovakis, not because she is committed to some safe, ironic, bystander nihilism, but because it's salutary and cautionary, always to think of how it could be otherwise, how you and the others could be on the wrong side of a war or a question, or a form of procedure. The poems of You and Three Others Are Approaching a Lake all take their titles and some of their language and tone from other texts, resituating language and topic and pronoun so that they may be otherwise, wise about the other. In a note to that text, Moschovakis describes her procedure in deliberately general but quite crucial terms. Quote, "The 4 long poems in this volume were inspired by books chosen by title and appearance from the shelves of the Biblio Barn, a miraculous used bookstore in South Courtright, New York. Language is borrowed, premises are adopted or argued with, tones are emulated or thwarted. I'm grateful for the existence of these books, all of which take a bold stand toward their topics and the 20th century world they inhabited." Out of used books, Moschovakis upcycles The Tragedy of Waste, and 3 other poems about persons and materials and their incessant relation, presenting history as something to reuse with a difference, adopt, argue with, emulate, and even thwart. Moschovakis' books are not only about history, though, but about what poetry can say about it, and about how it might distinguish its own activity, what precisely is your procedure, from the tragedy of waste taking place everywhere off the page. Which is why procedure is a key word for this poet, I think. It links art practice to the rest of the world system's collisional policies, reminding us that procedure might describe a method of harvesting language from a book, but could be equally applicable as a legal euphemism for an extra-legal form of torture, like waterboarding. In her new book, They and We Will Get Into Trouble for This, Moschovakis continues to braid the personal and the procedural like no one else. The first poem, a prose poem called Paradise, Film 2, presents a prose structure constantly cut, often against syntax, by a double vertical bar. I just found out it's called a gletus. That functions as a kind of internal prose enjambment, linking what it separates. The poem lets verse and prose co-occupy the same verbal substance until it makes sense to say of a prose paragraph, as the poem itself claims at one point, that it is a paragraph with 10 lines. Paradise uses this iterated genre-liminal procedure to interleave the poet's own undergraduate history here at Berkeley with Kierkegaard's Nights of Faith and Resignation, and Abraham's attempted sacrifice of Isaac, and the etymology of Holocaust, which means that the poem moves from her own relation to the first-person pronoun into its liquidation in religious duty and genocide. In another poem from the book, What It Means to Be Avant-Garde, we encounter an alternational structure. First, a page and a half of excursus on David Anton, from whom the title, What It Means to Be Avant-Garde, comes, and an unnamed condition of the speaker, and then the constant interruption of that by honest or sly answers to online self-tests. In the last poem in the book, Flat White, we encounter a, quote, corrupted translation, in which the poet wanders in and out of actual translations of Samira Nagrush while presenting numbered sections out of sequence, so mixing writers, languages, topics, and ideas of order. I to you and 3 others, they and we. Like the pronominal situations in her titles, Moschovakis' new poems put people, including herself and her author function, into the trouble of relation, using procedure to break down the distance between persons without denying the differences between them. Her poems are neither authorless machines nor Luddite lyrics, and their forms silently declare this neither-norism everywhere in their structures. Instead, Moschovakis is primarily a poet of community, of deliberately indistinct collectivity, of the work it takes and always will take to approach paradise, trouble it, and find everyone there. Please join me in welcoming the Holloway Lecturer in the Practice of Poetry, Anna Moschovakis.
That was sort of like an out-of-body experience, which is probably as it should be. Thank you, Jeffrey. And thank you, Jeffrey and Jane, and for this reading, and really everybody here, all the faculty and graduate students who've made me feel very welcome here, and especially the amazing and awesome and fierce poets that I get to spend Tuesday and Thursday afternoons with. You guys are the best. Here we go. Paradise, Film 2. I don't know a thing about paradise. In my house, nobody ever brought it up. In college, I learned about Kierkegaard's nights, the night of resignation and the night of faith. I wanted to be a knight of faith, as did the professor and everyone else in the class, I assumed. I was born in paradise and raised in science. The semester I studied Kierkegaard, I also took calculus, which I failed. I fell in love with the sounds of cypresses in the wind. There is the female cypress and the male cypress, and it was the male I loved. That same semester I also read The Symposium by Plato in Walter Hamilton's English translation. You will remember The Symposium is about a dinner party, and you are familiar with the story in it told by the comedian Aristophanes about the search for love, the origin of longing, how we have all been split in two, broken, each half doomed to wander far and wide in search of the other. We refer to this story, which Socrates belittled, in common expressions like "she completes me" and "how is your better half?" And even when we refer to finding the one or our soulmate. In the culture in which I was raised, after premarital sex, divorce and remarriage became accepted, then commonplace, it became possible to find your soulmate not just once, but twice, 3 times or more, and to declare it to the world across platforms, even in a church. Anxiety over this development, which may be described using a term I learned the same semester I flunked calculus, read Kierkegaard, Teresa Hakyang Cha, and The Symposium as a paradigm shift, is pervasive if unacknowledged, for how can you find your other half more than once? They say the human body regenerates itself every 7 years. By they I mean modern science. And in the 5th century before Christ, Heraclitus wrote, "This est ton afton potamon ukanemphaios," which we are told means you can't step in the same river twice. The conventional marriage ceremony, derived from the Catholics, still calls for the promise to remain, for richer or poorer, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, etc. Being raised in science under the sign of logic, I never understood how certain promises could be made. I could say, I promise that unless something unexpected happens, I will do the dishes every night this week. I was very literal, especially with my lovers. I could say, I love you today, but not I will love you tomorrow. I'm in this for the long haul. I would have made a terrible bride, which might be why the only marriage proposal I received was on a transatlantic phone call with an unhinged person who knew I would say no. I had a good relationship with a philosopher, fall irrevocably apart over my inability to perform what I had learned to call speech acts, a term coined by J.L. Austin and developed by John Searle, whose class I also took in college, though sometime after the disaster of the calculus. I went to Paradise with a friend, Hope. During our stay, another friend went home to Ohio with his camera, sent a photo, "Hell is real," across a billboard, which I received on my phone. Growing up, I watched a show on public television, Connections, in which the host followed a trail wherever it led across time, space, and disciplinary divides. This before the invention of hypertext markup language, broadband, FOMO, or the smartphone. Connections was a big influence on my work. Freud said the 2 things most important in life are love and work. I'm paraphrasing, having never read Freud, at least not the part where he wrote about this. I am working in Paradise. There's a bird here that makes a noise like a typewriter, Smith Corona or Olivetti, a manual. I don't know what bird it is. I don't know the story of Adam and Eve, except in its vulgar outline. I have thought about reading it in the Bible, but there are so many other books I want to get to first. I thought I could kill 2 birds with 1 stone, so to speak, by reading it in French to practice my comprehension so that in some sense it would constitute work. I turn pages under Birds of Paradise, try to find the passage, can't. There is one story from the Bible I know quite well, the one about Abraham and his son Isaac. I know it from its appearance in Fear and Trembling by Kierkegaard. I did find the story of Abraham and Isaac in the Bible. It's in Genesis. I was surprised at how short it was and by some of the wording. Or, après ces événements, Dieu mit Abraham à l'épreuve et lui dit, Abraham, il répondit, me voici. Il reprit, prends ton fils, ton unique Isaac que tu aimes, pars pour le pays de Moria, et là tu l'offriras en holocauste sur celle des montagnes que je t'indiquerai. I was surprised by the use of the word holocauste when the word I expected was sacrifice, a word that does exist in French, spelled just as in English, with the identical dictionary definition. I made a note to go to the library back home, or the internet, I guess, to look at King James and see what word is there. It occurred to me also that I'd never wondered at the origin of the word Holocaust before it came to refer to the genocides of World War II, thousands of years after Abraham was talked into murder, and a century after Kierkegaard wrote, under a pseudonym, Johannes de Silencio, his Fear and Trembling. The story of Abraham and Isaac is 5 paragraphs long, is told simply, without psychologizing. The characters are affectless. It's like a script, waiting for actors to fill it with emotion. When Freud said love and work, I assume he meant meaningful work, but it still seems further definition is required. When I say I'm working in paradise, I refer to one kind of work, to the writing of this film, which you are now watching, finding meaningful, I hope, as I found meaning in the process of its creation. Another type of work I perform in paradise is cleaning, mostly dishwashing, which I enjoy but do not find particularly meaningful. And yet another type of work I perform is the intensive pruning of olive trees in an ancient olive grove, which I both enjoy and find meaningful, since it allows me to commune with nature and with a notion of the past. I am not paid for this work. I was not paid to go to paradise. In fact, I covered my room and board and volunteered my labor. There are 10 episodes of Connections, 10 lines per page of this poem, 10 commandments, tribes, and he, Boaz, took 10 men of the elders as judges and said, sit down, and they sat. Medea sacrificed both of her children, though no God asked her to, and unlike Abraham, she has rarely been praised for the intention, much less the execution of this act. In a film version of Medea by Lars von Trier, the scene of the execution is filled with emotion, though stark, wordless. It is written on their faces. Exterior hill, day, woman ascends hill, her sons in her arms. While Abraham believed Isaac, after the sacrifice, would rise to paradise, or so I assume, Medea would not have been afforded such comfort, the Greeks holding a different conception of paradise, a place inhabited by gods, inaccessible to mortals, even after death. This, along with the fact that Medea's reasons for killing her children were essentially, or at least ostensibly, selfish, make her act appear less like a sacrifice and more like slaughter. After God spares Abraham the agony of killing his only son, qu'il aime, a ram appears and Abraham kills it instead. Il alla le prendre pour l'offrir en holocauste à la place de son fils. We are told that Abraham named this place Le Seigneur voit, and reminded it's still common to say, c'est sur la montagne que le Seigneur est vu, a phrase rendered in the King James Version of the Bible as, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen, but in other more recent versions as, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided, a translation that brings out the hold in behold, the link between seeing and having for keeps. I don't know how the passage reads in The Message, the Bible, in contemporary language, published in 2005 and rated on average 4.5 stars in more than 900 customer reviews. But I know that each year, on the anniversary of his death, Martin Luther King Jr. proclaims on the airwaves, he's been to the mountain, is not fearing any man. that Medea killed her children, whom she loved, deliberately was a revision of the traditional myth, which itself had alternate endings, one claiming their deaths were an accident, the other blaming the citizens of Corinth, neither of which appears to have been sufficiently tragic for the playwright Euripides, who added in filicide. Holocaust, it turns out, does mean sacrifice to the gods, or etymologically, something like burnt whole. The preferred term for the extermination of Jews is now Shoah, for catastrophe, the Greek origin of which combines down with turn, as in a sudden end or reversal of the expected, a definition that emphasizes the result of the thing, the plot over the act, the work of slaughter. I don't know if it's accurate or appropriate to draw a correlation between the mountain in MLK's speech and the mountain in Genesis 22. The professor who taught me Kierkegaard, Dreyfus, seemed to make the connection between King and Abraham by suggesting, as I recall, that both would qualify under Kierkegaard's definition as knights of faith, able to see the dagger hanging over their beloveds and not recoil, but love the more fiercely. There is a danger of sentimentality in this view to be weighed against the danger of the critique of sentiment. There's a library in paradise, and in it a book, Disbelief and Faith Are Not What You Think, written by someone named Jean-François Cisse. I liked his name and the fact that in French, the title, L'incroyance et la foi ne sont pas ce qu'on croit, rhymes. This book, he writes, is an invitation to an experimental faith, a humble, vulnerable faith. In another book I found the etymology of the term entrainment, used in certain psychoanalytic texts to describe the transmission of affect between individuals. In other words, contagion, suggesting we are not contained within the contours of our bodies, the outlines of our skin. The language of halfness in Aristophanes' speech may be an attempt to explain metaphorically, hence inaccurately, and well before Freud and the dawn of psychoanalysis, this fluidity of boundaries. Entraîner, the infinitive of the French entraînement, means simply to train, as in for the Olympics or for success in love. It turns out the last line in the marriage liturgy originates from the Book of Common Prayer, 1549, where it read, "Till death us depart," so different to my ear from its 1662 replacement, "Till death us do part," as the former seems to emphasize the us of the departure, the tearing asunder of both from earth and not of one from the other. And I retain that sense of distinction even after learning that the meaning of the phrases is the same. It turns out my understanding, such as it is, of tragedy was shaped during that fateful semester less by the Greeks than by Cha, the only woman writer I remember being assigned. It turns out Heraclitus never said the thing about stepping into the river again, that it was probably a disciple forgotten by history or some poor scribe bursting with inspiration. I was alerted to this fallacy, as well as to the fact that Kierkegaard means churchyard in the philosopher's native Danish, years later by the novelist David Markson, another influence on my work, a knight of resignation, perhaps, who is now here with us in paradise. Entraîner, to pull or to carry, away or along, to train, to lead to cause, bring about, an invitation to a faith, a humble experiment, an influence, the necessity of its critique. When I went to paradise, it rained for 10 days straight. I walked up the hill to the mountaintop. The olive grove flooded for 40 nights. I forgot the word for a poem with 10 lines, but you can look it up from most anywhere if you want to know. I failed to follow instructions. I got lost for a while. This was years ago. I forgot my camera and had to take pictures on my phone. I shared them with everyone and saved them all for myself. very glad to be here right now, surrounded as I am by ghosts. My grandmother studied geology on this campus. She came from Worcester, Massachusetts, the daughter of she had no siblings. She advanced quickly, but patriarchy made her quit the institution before she earned her PhD. My grandfather earned his PhD in geology, also from this institution. My mother, after an unhappy freshman year at a different institution, transferred here and thrived. She had no siblings. She was the first woman in her family to earn a PhD. It took her extra years to get tenure at the liberal arts college where she worked for 3 decades. Her clock was paused by 3 pregnancies, 2 children. In 1988, newly enrolled at this institution, I failed to drop out of a math class before the deadline. I begged the professor to let me withdraw. I cried in his office, but he held fast. I sat for the final. In the blue book, I wrote a limerick about a person who preferred writing poems to sitting for exams. The professor knew my parents from the math scene. He called them concerned for my mental health. I think it was the tears, but he said it was the poem, the last stanzas of which went something like this. Ta-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, ta-da-da-da-da-da-da, ta-da-da-da-da, ta-da-da-da-da, and off a tall building she leapt. In 2010, I dropped out of my doctoral program where I'd been matriculated or registered on record for 10 years. I have 1 sibling, no children, no PhD. I really am very glad to be here right now, the luckiest person on earth, standing on the shoulders of ghosts. I sometimes suspect writing poetry is just an excuse to indulge my compulsion to embarrass myself, which must be why I just read you the most embarrassing poem I could have chosen to read in this context. In 2016, I gave a bad interview about my work that was insensitively edited and posted to the internet. I spent days in the shame of insignificant exposure, then vowed never to ad-lib on record again, hence these scripted notes wedged between my 2 poems tonight. He said it was the poem, but I think it was the tears. I mean, the material is autobiographical, or the material is somewhat autographical, is autocorrected. The material, or the sickness of what doesn't seem able to change, to wear the look, or seem to be able, or optics, or, oh yeah, undergrad self. Oh, it's just the relation of being to time. No, of beings to time. Or, oh, it's just midlife? No. Oh, yeah. What it means to be avant-garde, after David Anton. I feel sad. I feel discouraged about the future. I feel I have failed more than the average person. As I look back on my life, all I can see is a lot of failures. I don't get real satisfaction out of anything anymore. I am dissatisfied or bored with everything. I feel quite guilty most of the time. I expect to be punished. I am disgusted with myself. I am critical of myself for my weaknesses or mistakes. I blame myself for everything bad that happens. I have thoughts of killing myself, but I would not carry them out. I would like to kill myself. I would kill myself if I had the chance. I don't cry any more than usual. I used to be able to cry, but now I can't cry even though I want to. I am no more irritated by things than I ever was. I am slightly more irritated now than usual. I have lost all of my interest in other people. I make decisions about as well as I ever could. I can't make decisions at all anymore. I am worried that I am looking old or unattractive. I feel there are permanent changes in my appearance that make me look unattractive. I have to push myself very hard to do anything. I don't sleep as well as I used to. I wake up several hours earlier than I used to and cannot get back to sleep. I get tired from doing almost anything. My appetite is not as good as it used to be. My appetite is much worse now. I have lost more than 5 pounds. I have lost more than 15 pounds. I am worried about physical problems like aches, pains, upset stomach, or constipation. I am very worried about physical problems, and it's hard to think of much else. I have not noticed any recent change in my interest in sex. I have lost interest in sex completely. I was in the park when they called, with my head on my knee and my nose in a book. The book was by David Anton, an American. There are many ways to follow a thought. When the phone rang, they told me they wanted me. There was a voice on the phone that belonged to a man. It sounded like a man, and him saying they wanted me. I read a book the other day by a circus performer. In my youth, I read a book by an anthropologist's son, who ran off with the gypsies with his parents' blessing. The anthropologist's son was not an American. The circus performer was unstable emotionally. She committed suicide at the age of 42. The man said, "We want you to come in for some tests." The parents hoped the boy would grow up to write a book in which he'd detail the functioning of Romani culture. Before the phone rang, I was reading the bit in the Anton about how it's a good thing to be on the fringe. The boy learned the gypsies don't lie to their own. Coterie makes you soft. When I went in for the tests, they said I was normal, and only after I did a lot of research on the internet did I come to understand what they meant by that was that my condition is unexplained. I feel downhearted and blue most of the time. Morning is when I feel the best, some of the time. I have crying spells or feel like it, good part of the time. I have trouble sleeping at night, a little of the time. I eat as much as I used to, good part of the time. I still enjoy sex a little of the time. I notice that I am losing weight some of the time. I have trouble with constipation a little of the time. My heart beats faster than usual some of the time. I get tired for no reason, good part of the time. My mind is as clear as it used to be a little of the time. I find it easy to do the things I used to some of the time. I am restless and can't keep still most of the time. I feel hopeful about the future a little of the time. I am more irritable than usual most of the time. I find it easy to make decisions. I feel that I am useful and needed some of the time. My life is pretty full a little of the time. I feel that others would be better off if I were dead most of the time. I still enjoy the things I used to do. I had forgotten the name of the anthropologist's son. It was mid-morning and I was sitting at my desk, taking the last sip of my morning decaf with soy. The last sip is always cold and unsatisfying. This was not my first attempt to recover the boy's name. I had of course forgotten the book's title as well. I typed Dutch Gypsy Narrative Young Anthropologist into my machine. For 15 years I've been trying to recall the name of the boy or of the book. I may even have unsuccessfully searched for them before. During those years I recreated a memory of the narrative. He is beloved by the group and accepted as one of them. He does not miss his parents, though he holds them in high esteem. He learns to sing from a dark-haired man and to steal from a dark-haired girl. The boy himself is as blonde as a broom. The feeling of not knowing is like flying in your dreams. Around the time I started searching, I stopped dreaming anything fun. Dutch Gypsy Narrative Young Anthropologist did the trick. His name came up and I remembered it. Recognition makes you fall, but you can try to resist, though you'll make yourself ridiculous flapping all around. I switched windows and searched for my unexplained condition. There are lots of people who have it and none of them can spell. It turns out I was wrong about my search being successful. The name I thought I recognized was of a different person, an 18th century abolitionist who fell in love with a slave. He slept with many others, but only fell in love once. I did another search and this time left out nationality. I typed son of anthropologists adopted by gypsies. When mysteries are explained, they don't exactly disappear. The boy was Belgian, not Dutch, and that had been my mistake. The man called back to say one of my test results was compromised. The title of the book is The Gypsies. Feeling nervous, anxious, or on edge nearly every day. Not being able to stop or control worrying more than half the days. Worrying too much about different things several days. Trouble relaxing more than half the days. Being so restless that it's hard to sit still several days. Becoming easily annoyed or irritable nearly every day. Feeling afraid as if something awful might The Gypsies was republished in 1987, a time that can still be called my youth. I was living in Los Angeles waiting for high school to end. My condition would not manifest for another 20 years. In the talk where David Anton discusses life on the Fringe, he is in Los Angeles at an art space called Lace. I don't know what year it was, but I could have been there. Growing up in a metropolis can make you soft. I've been going to the same art institutions most of my life. You have the sense you should be heading inevitably for the center. When people ask me where I live, I say the middle of nowhere. Under certain circumstances, it requires effort to stay on the fringe. What we're told about gypsies is they make no home. In 1957, David Anton was living in Manhattan in an apartment that cost him $18.50 a month. When I moved to Manhattan, it was 1993, the same year Anton's talk on the Fringe would be published. I paid $400 a month to live in the East Village. I fell in love with a cook at the restaurant where I waitressed. He carried a knife on the subway because his city was dangerous. He made me feel totally, irrevocably Californian. The blizzard that winter was record-breaking. We spent our nights at the restaurant and our days in the darkroom. We woke in strangers' apartments on Avenue D. We buried 2 friends in a matter of months. Sometimes an image moves to the center of a life. His mother and stepfather were trained anthropologists. Looking now at the pictures, I can see we were happy. When we broke up, he asked if I was leaving him for art. Eventually, he became an editor at Rolling Stone. We had a drink at a bar, and I explained my condition. He gave me many books during our 4 years together. One of them was The Gypsies. I can easily tell if someone else wants to enter a conversation. Strongly agree. I prefer animals to humans. Strongly disagree. I try to keep up with the current trends and fashions. Mildly agree. I dream most nights. No answer. I really enjoy caring for other people. I try to solve my own problems rather than discussing them with others. I find it hard to know what to do in a social situation. I am at my best first thing in the morning. It doesn't bother me too much if I am late meeting a friend. I would never break a law, no matter how minor. I often find it difficult to judge if something is rude or polite. I prefer practical jokes to verbal humor. If I see a stranger in a group, I think it's up to them to make an effort to join in. I usually stay emotionally detached when watching a film. I can easily work out what another person might want to talk about. I can tell if someone is masking their true emotion. Before making a decision, I always weigh the pros and cons. I live for today rather than for the future. In The Fringe, David Anton talks about the white light. If you were raised in the center, you know what he means. If you were born on the fringe, I can't know what you know, despite my high score on the empathy quotient test, devised by a doctor named Simon Baron-Cohen, a psychologist from Cambridge with 2 brothers in showbiz, directors of independent British films, another white light, bright but not blinding, like the one that shines on their cousin, Sasha, sued for libel by the Roma in 2006. Still, the white light shines from name to name. Empathy has been theorized in many ways. The first I encountered was that of David Hume, though he doesn't use the word, instead splitting sympathy into a complex mode of experience in which the process of understanding is reversed, from impression to idea to impression. There are many ways to think about loss. The Roma are known to originate in India, not Egypt or Romania as once was believed, thus the misnomer gypsy and its derivative slurs. And still there are gypsies living in India. I've read they make their livings selling broomsticks and tools, except the ones committed to religious begging. Many people from the white light of LA or New York take journeys to India to study yoga, for example. I know some of them, and they are very nice people. I imagine they score high on the empathy quotient test. What I'm trying to get at is impossible to say. The people we buried put us in the ground too, from impression to idea and back again. The grounding is temporary and we eventually move on. I heard some bad news when I woke up this morning. My condition had faded to the back of my mind. The news came from a friend, a translator from India, a new friend I'd met on the organized Fringe. I never knew life would be so much about death. I wrote to him that there were no words for his suffering, a tautological statement with a paradox at its heart. A week ago, we all sat together on the grass, indulging in the first warm rays of spring sun. The translator was the only one sitting in the shade. This he attributed to the heat in his country of origin. Calcutta may as well be the middle of nowhere. It never has topped my list of places to visit. Now empathy has made me want to get on a plane. I wonder if this is what Anton means, to be alive in the perfectly reasonable, shabby human light. My hand ahead of my heart, ahead of my hand. Crossed arms, folded arms, defensiveness, reluctance. Crossed arms with clenched fists, hostile defensiveness. Gripping own upper arms, insecurity. One arm across body clasping other arm by side, female, nervousness. Arms held behind body with hands clasped, confidence, authority. Handbag held in front of body, female, nervousness. Holding papers across chest, mainly male, nervousness. Adjusting cuff, watch strap, tie, etc. using an arm across the body, nervousness. Arms, hands covering genital region, male, nervousness. Holding a drink in front of body with both hands, nervousness. Seated, holding drink on one side with hand from other side, nervousness. Touching or scratching shoulder, using arm across body, nervousness. Just as I was getting to the part about Vietnam, I misplaced Anton's book in a series of moves. There was a time when I might just have ordered another. But that was before the economic crash of the aughts, so I am left to imagine what connections should be drawn between the war, the fringe, and the blinding white light. What we know about connections is they're often wrong. In high school, I lived in Athens, Greece, a capital city if there ever was one. Some gypsies made their home a few blocks from our apartment, an unofficial country on waterfront land. That was before the economic boom of the 90s and the amenities necessitated by the coming Olympics. During one of my moves, I found a copy of The Tourist, the newer edition with a foreword by Lucy Lepard. The question of staged authenticity had been on my mind. In her foreword, Lepard admits to having a bad memory, which she relies on to allow her to do some thinking of her own. There are many ways to think about origin. I frequently seek out the assistance of others. I wonder if I will eventually become inured to my condition, the way explorers acclimate to the thin air up high, that fringe of the body's ability to breathe. I woke up in a sweat, convinced I was elsewhere, a tourist attraction at the back of my mind. I dreamed I had found the book I'd misplaced, that I'd read the rest of the piece on the fringe. It was full of war and art and piss, the relationship of markers to sight. I had coffee with a geographer in Boulder, Colorado. The air was so thin I was gulping for breath. He'd just returned from another trip to China. We talked about Anton Lepard and my condition. He made me feel totally irrevocably soft. We'll probably never see each other again. Later, I wrote something down in my notebook. It had to do with my questions about being a tourist, and something the geographer had smilingly said. Returning is different from covering the same ground. I held my coffee on one side with my hand from the other. Nervousness gestures to feelings fringe. The boy returned to the gypsies every year for a decade. The camp in Athens is now a seaside cafe. If you want to be the one who goes back, go back. I've no theory about how to be. The government should subsidize struggling museums, theaters, and artists. I am troubled by the eroding distinction between entertainment and marketing. Protesters cause more good than harm. A person cannot be truly spiritual without regularly attending church or temple. Something like the theory of natural selection explains why some people are homeless. If countries are unwilling to cooperate with our military plans, we should treat them as enemies. I feel guilty when I shop at a large national chain. Social justice should be the foundation of any economic system. People shouldn't be allowed to have children they can't provide for. I would defend my property with lethal force. The world would be better if there were no huge corporations. Professional athletes are paid too much money. The separation of church and state has demoralized our society. The Word of God exists only as human beings interpret it. We need stronger laws protecting the environment. I would feel better if there were video cameras on most street corners. It should be legal for consenting adults to challenge each other to a duel. I took a break from my condition to start translating a novel, a story about neo-Nazis in Paris, France. It's set in the late 90s when I was living in Paris. The protagonist and I lived on the very same street. Sometimes a place moves to the center of a life. The author of the book is politically on the left. My father lived through the occupations of Athens. 3 times his home was taken over by soldiers. The novel makes an argument about slippage at the extremes, how it's possible to move effortlessly between far left and far right. It offers as an example one Jacques Doriot, communist mayor in the 30s of Saint-Denis, a suburb of Paris at its northern fringe. My father didn't talk about that part of his childhood. I never could be sure that my impression of it was real. There was one story he liked to tell about that time, the story of Apostolos Santas, aka Lakis, who scaled the Acropolis in April of 41, tore down the Nazi flag and put nothing in its place, a symbolic act for which he was sentenced to death in absentia. Jacques Doriot turned fascist in 1936. He wore the SS uniform into his grave. Saint-Denis hosts a campus of the University of Paris. In 1991, I took some classes there. The students it attracted were the self-described Fringe. The graffiti on the walls has been painted over since then. I signed up for a class with a man named Voirnet. The title of the class was Philosophy and Art. The name of the professor was spelled like the sunglasses. At the time, you could smoke and drink beer in the classroom. Varney kept his inside a brown paper bag. Apostolos Santos did not act alone. He captured the flag with Manolis Glezos, who later led the Coalition for the Radical Left. Apostolos died in 2011, a recipient of medals from the Greek state. Manolis was arrested by Athens riot police as recently as October of 2012. When I was at Saint-Denis, I kept a low profile. Desert Storm was in force and I was still an American. I marched for peace and wages with the thousands in the streets, but nothing brought them out like the loss of March the 2nd. Lucien Gainsbourg, the French-Ukrainian who changed his name to Serge. Sometimes a voice moves the center to a halt. When Lucien was a boy, he wore the yellow star. When he tried to be a singer, he was mocked for his nose. In the years that followed, he moved as if inevitably toward the center. In '75, he made an album that satirized the Nazis. There's something I haven't told you that has to do with my condition. The night Serge Gainsbourg died, I heard all of Paris weeping. When I cry for these imperfect things. If someone is crying, you avert your eyes. If you think someone's ugly, you take top and shorts. If someone picks up a lost purse, you tell them you trust everyone. If your friend asks you who you trust the most, you only if the situation required it. If you are going to church, you wear 10 to 15 times. If you are very religious and someone who follows a different religion preaches to you, in average, how often do you lie a day? Would you tell a white lie to make someone feel better? What saying would you say you most often follow? Which of the following is the correct definition of moral? My condition is rare, but it still affects thousands. It's easy to feel like I'm being punished by God. Not believing in God can have damaging consequences. The source of punishment tends to revert to the self. Self-punishment is the base of many social dynamics. A sense of conscience can be wielded from within or without. The Gypsies hold a Kantian belief about ethics, this according to the European who spent his youth among them, wherein stealing is judged permissible according to intent. It is possible that I can make peace with my condition if I can convince myself its intent is benign. There's a mediation technique called nonviolent communication, conventionally known as NVC. I try to use it in relation to my desire to be cured. The goal is to do away with judgments of value and focus on everyone's needs being met. The relation of the Gypsy code to Kant is as follows. For Kant, a right action is spoiled by impure intent. This aligns well with the NVC model, in which an act of generosity is immediately voided if revealed to be spurred by resentment or guilt. For the boys Gypsies, stealing was morally neutral as long as nobody's needs were denied. Take one chicken from the farmer, but not the whole coop. There are many ways to think about dessert. This neutrality was voided if greed entered the picture. NVC holds a broad understanding of violence. It would encompass even my own relation to my condition. My conscience tells me empathy for the self is undeserved. The website contains an inventory of needs, which are neatly divided into 7 subsections that begin with connection and end with meaning. This positioning of meaning calls out my condition. My needs are out of date. Acceptance, affection, appreciation, belonging. cooperation, communication, closeness, community, companionship, compassion, consideration, consistency, empathy, inclusion, intimacy, love, mutuality, nurturing, respect, self-respect, safety, security, stability, support, to know and be known, to see and be seen, to understand and be understood, trust, warmth, air, food, movement, exercise, rest, sleep, sexual expression, safety, shelter, touch, water, authenticity, integrity, presence, joy, humor, beauty, communion, ease, equality, harmony, inspiration, choice, freedom, independence, space, spontaneity, awareness, celebration of life, challenge, clarity, competence, consciousness, contribution, creativity, discovery, efficacy, effectiveness, growth, hope, learning, mourning, participation, purpose, self-expression, stimulation, to matter, understanding. The title of this poem doesn't come from the Fringe, but from the name of the book in which it appears, and a talk therein that shares that name, that served as a balm when there was no cure. The Roma are said to be bonded by language. The Greeks were bonded by language too. The ancients were, and the moderns are. Anton's right that the light makes it hard to see. My condition has something to do with this too. I was wrong about the profession of the Belgian boy's parents. His father was an artist who worked in stained glass, who trained as a painter under Gustave Moreau. His mother is described as an artsy pacifist. My father has since told me all he remembers. The boy was a man when he left the gypsies. He was arrested by the Gestapo in 1943. He moved to New York to start a family. By 1959, he was living in Hell's Kitchen. I wonder if he and Anton met on the Fringe. My father's mother marched up and challenged the soldiers. My mother's mother had my condition too. I write to the cook when another friend dies. I type, what would an ethical happiness look like? The Fringe ends with a pail of Guggenheim piss. The list ends with 21 meanings of meaning. I finished the translation, but the work doesn't end. It will end. It moves inevitably toward its end. Thank you for listening.